minutes. It's a minute to 7. Some more people will surely be logging on.
Okay, no problem.
Just to introduce you, this is Professor Sima Avramovich. He's the head of the forum.
Good evening, Professor. Nice to meet you. There you are.
1900.
Good evening. Nice to meet you.
7 o'clock exactly. It is a bit too early now with a lot of sun here in Rome. It looks like 4 or 5 o'clock in the afternoon. Perfect. I think that some people will join us, but it is really not very proper period now in summertime. So we have to think about 7 o'clock in the afternoon. Maybe we should postpone it for 8 or something. But nevertheless, it is our traditional term for 52 years now. Well, I'm just making an informal introduction. We invented, well, I was a part of the invention of Forvm Romanvm 52 years ago. It was 1970 exactly. And it was the idea of Professor my Professor Stojcevic picked up the idea from Europe. One of those who was our first guest and who attended Forvm Romanvm many, many times, all together with her wife, was a very famous scholar in ancient Greek law. And I'm sure that you know Professor Theodorides, Aristides Theodorides, who was writing mainly about private law. For example, I remember very well his lecture in 1970s about the will of Naunachte, famous testament. Then his lectures and papers about the notion of maats and many, many other things, but we never had anything about criminal law in Egypt. And this is, I'm so happy to have someone after so many decades without ancient Egyptian law. Nina, could you help me? Did we have anything about law of ancient Egypt in the meantime after Theodorides?
Well, I haven't been along all.
Of course,
all
you're
time,
not born then.
The last thing
you're not born there, definitely.
The last thing I think we had on Egypt was when I was maybe still a student and it wasn't legal. Maybe I was starting at the faculty. I don't know. It was Daniela Stefanovic, something about the writing in ancient Egypt, but it wasn't a strictly legal subject. And I'm not sure we've had an Egyptian subject since, or if we had, it wasn't in the last 10 years at the very least.
Yeah.
So
perfect.
We're very happy to bring back Egypt to the forum.
Oh, that's good.
So people do seem to be logging in. Hello, Valentina.
And just to use this opportunity.
Hello.
Just to use the opportunity to remember some details about visits of Professor Theodorides to Belgrade. He was always coming to Belgrade with her wife. I think that he was our guest at least 5 times. And one of the best photos of my son, who was born in 1970, was taken in my old car on the back seat, done by Professor Theodorides. And this is something that is a part of our memory. Then also a wonderful photo at the top of Petrovaradin, the hill near the city of Novi Sad on the Danube River, with Professor Theodorides and his wife. So we have some booklets which we edited for 40 years of existence on Forvm Romanvm. And Nina and I had idea to make some booklets for 5th or for the 10th jubileum. Unfortunately, we didn't complete it. Corona and many other things. I moved from Belgrade
this year.
But we should do it. Never mind. It will be 53 years, but never mind. We should really make a memory of this 50th anniversary. Hello, Milena.
Hello.
She is also the one who knows Professor Theodorides. Do you remember him?
Of course I know Professor Theodorides, yes.
Yeah, for many times we met, but what was the year when he died? I don't remember.
That's right. Well, I'm really happy that we start this meeting with the homage, a kind of homage to Professor Theodorides, hoping that now we will have Lisa just for the first meeting online and maybe to meet you in Belgrade to continue the tradition, to have people who are dealing with ancient Egyptian law to be in Belgrade in Forum Romanum for, let's say, 53rd, 54th anniversary. You are very warmly invited, Lisa,
Thank you.
and I'm really happy that we have one of us who is involved in ancient Egyptian law to be a part of our society, or better to say, of our family. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Do you want me to start in?
Yep.
Okay. All right. Well, thank everyone again, and especially Dr. Anina, who contacted me for asking me to come and talk about law, crime, and punishment in ancient Egypt. We might get a little heavy on the crime and punishment tonight, which is a little sobering, but there are some very interesting court cases that we have evidence for, which I'm going to talk about. But first of all, I think I'll just do a bit of an introduction in the sense that in ancient Egypt, you know, we have a very long-lasting civilization. In approximately 3,200 BC, we have Egypt formed as one state under one king who was divine and considered to be the falcon god Horus, as well as the son of the sun god. And the creation myth that the Egyptians put together that for them explained creation is that in the beginning there was nothing, and there was dark water and nothingness. And out of the water came this spit of land in which the sun god came down and landed on um, in the manifestation of a very large bird. And he created and he began life. But what existed at the same time as the creation of life in the world was a concept called Ma'at. And Ma'at is, well, the word ends in T, which makes it a feminine word in ancient Egyptian. And the goddess Ma'at was considered to be what was cosmic order. When you had Ma'at, there was a foundation of some kind of rule, of balance, of things being correct. Sometimes it's even translated as truth and justice. It sort of set a moral standard for ancient Egyptian society. And there are even statements about how humans should do and speak Ma'at. And the most important responsibility of the king was actually to uphold Ma'at. And he did that by doing things that made the gods and goddesses happy. And in many temples, there are these scenes where the king is handing out his hand to them, and in the hand is a small statue of the goddess Ma'at, and he is literally giving Ma'at to them to show that he is acting in a responsible way that will keep order and life and these standards going. Now, there's another word that we know from later by the Middle Kingdom, so about 1,000 years later, the word hep. And hep has had many translations. It ranges from rule, habit, custom, principle to law. But in the papers that we have from court cases, they do refer to Hep as being what they follow. So that seems to be the closest word that is like the modern conception of law. Now, just to explain a little bit about the king's relationship to law, the king was really not involved in making law or setting down law or making sure that it was followed. A king could put out a decree in which he would demand that certain things were done or certain properties belonged to certain temples, and no one could touch this land and no one could take the laborers that worked on it and things like that. He could set aside things and say these were special, can't touch them, can't do them. Or he could put out a decree about how certain things were not allowed to happen, particularly in terms of interfering with the economy and laborers and taxes and things like that. But it's not really law. It's more that he could demand certain things or control certain things. The one thing the king did do in terms of law is if someone was found guilty and was going to be put to death, he had to know about it and agree with it before it happened. But the person that was in charge of all of this and was doing all of this was the vizier. He was the most powerful official under the king. And we know that the vizier was also given the title, and it's probably a symbolic title, but he was called the high priest of Ma'at. So the vizier was really in charge of making sure that laws were followed and laws were kept. And I want to read part of a text from the installation of a vizier. And this vizier's name is Rekmi Ray. And in his tomb at Thebes, he wrote the entire speech that King Tutmosis III were talking about around 1450 BC at this time. He gave a speech to the vizier when he put him in office. And of course, the vizier does many other things. But one of the things the vizier does as the high priest of Ma'at is that he is the chief justice. And there's just two little parts I'm going to read of what the king said that kind of gives you an idea of ancient Egyptian justice and how it was viewed. Lo, petitioners come from the south and the north. The whole land is eager for the counsel of the vizier. See to it that all is done according to law, that all is done exactly right, in giving a man his vindication. The magistrate who judges in public, wind and water report all that he does. Lo, there is no one who ignores his deeds. And then there's another little section where the king says, do not judge unfairly. God abhors partiality. This is an instruction. Plan to act accordingly. Regard one you know like one you don't, one near you like one far from you. The magistrate who acts like this will succeed in this place. So it's theoretical, of course, when you're saying things like this, but they did seem to set a fairly high standard in terms of law and how it was carried out. So now let's get down to the more of the nitty-gritty of how exactly these things were done. We know by the time of the New Kingdom, which is around 1500, and most of what we know about law is going to be in the period of the New Kingdom. So we're going to be talking pretty much from 1500 BC to down to 1000 BC. And there were two courts that were called the Great Courts. One was in the north at Heliopolis, which is also where the temple of the main temple of the sun god was. And the second court was in Thebes, which is where Karnak Temple, the temple of Amun-Ra, who's also a sun god, was located. So they were the two great courts. And there could be two viziers in Egypt, or there could be one. So sometimes there was one for each court, or at other times a single vizier would go back and forth. But they were not sitting justices like we have nowadays. They weren't there all the time. When a case had to be heard, they would put a court together. They weren't just waiting there in a specific place to have cases come to them. And so when something happened, and the vizier and the great courts only dealt with things that had to do with the state. So the king, the king's family, anything royal, officials who worked for the administration or the king, or anything to do with temples or anything religious property, things like that. These courts did not have anything to do with private people and their problems. The only thing that the great courts did mix in terms of private people was the ownership of land and the collection of taxes, because that was very important to the king. Excuse me. So if a court case had to be heard, the vizier would pick 8 other important officials and put them in the court with him, and they would be the judges for that time when the case was heard. So there would be these 8 officials, and there would be the defendant. There were no lawyers or anything else. There would be a scribe there writing down a document saying what happened and who said what, but there was no one else in the court. And for the most part, they were the cases that we have texts from have to do with theft from a temple, which makes it a state problem, breaking into royal tombs, which of course makes it a state problem. And then right at the end today, I'm going to talk to you about an assassination of a king and the documents we have from the investigation and the punishment of the people that did that. Now, if a private person had a problem, the problem that private people seem to have, particularly from one village where we have a lot of information, is theft. Sometimes assault, sometimes disagreements over inheritance and belongings, arguments because a bill wasn't paid, things like that. But those did not go to court unless you chose as the plaintiff to go to the local court, because there were local courts in all the villages, and then you could ask to you could say, oh, so and so took one of my goats and I want it back. Could you find someone to get him and make him give it back to me, or make this person pay the money that they owe me? So you could be a plaintiff and go to a local court, but mostly it was rather small sorts of things. For example, it's been noted we don't even have or know of a case of murder from ancient Egypt. They certainly must have had people murdered, but we don't have any evidence. We don't know about it. So mostly what we know about is from one village in the New Kingdom where they kept records from the local court, and then we have a number of state court documents. What's interesting is that the ancient Egyptians kept so many records. everything that was done in one of the great courts was written down and kept in archives for the vizier. And the decisions that were made for local courts were also written down and not only kept in the local courts, but they sent copies to the vizier's office. Because if for any reason someone wanted to appeal something done in a local court, the appeal had to go to the vizier. So he had to have these kinds of documents. And of course, treasuries kept documents that showed who owned what land and if they paid their taxes and things like that. So there was a lot of written material that would be used in these types of cases. Now, there's no they did not put laws together. They didn't collect and codify law in ancient Egypt, and that's been noted for years that they didn't do that. It was not until Darius I came to Egypt, because in the 27th dynasty, Egypt belonged to the Persian Empire, and Darius I had all the law papers drawn together, and they made lists of the laws and wrote it in Aramaic and in Egyptian Demotic. So that's the first time, around 522 BC, that they actually had a list of laws. But the Egyptians used precedents, which is interesting. There are a number of cases we know of where the scribe would note that someone brought up an earlier case and pointed out, oh, the person that did that once before was found guilty and had to do such and such. And that is, fits this situation. So they did know of past decisions, and they often would use that to make a decision in the court. So precedence was used, and that's done a lot, especially in law in the United States. It's heavily done on precedence. I want to tell you about a non-crime hearing, which is very interesting, and then we'll go on to the assassination discussion. There was a man whose name, he's called Mes or sometimes Mosa, because they did not write vowels in ancient Egyptian. Since it's a partially Semitic language, it's sort of like Arabic. They don't write vowels, just consonants. So you can get different spellings, but we'll call him Mosa. He was a scribe in the temple of the god Ptah, and on two walls of his tomb, he put the full text of a court case that he was the plaintiff in. Some of the blocks are gone, unfortunately, and the ones that with the decision, but we know from the scenes in the tomb and the way it's written what the decision was. But he was a little boy when his father died, and so he and his mother should inherit the land that he owned. And this land had been given to the family 200 years before, when his ancestor was in the army, and with King Akmosa, who was fighting the Hyksos, who had invaded Egypt and was chasing the Hyksos out of Egypt. And for his work in the military, the king rewarded his best officers with land. And this land had been handed down through the family for 200 years. And there had been 4 different court cases about the land and who it belonged to, because relatives were fighting and trying to get more land or get rid of some relatives and things like that. And when Mosa was a little boy, his father was in court trying to protect his land from someone who was trying to get it from him. And the father died. And the person who managed to get the land from him faked some documents and took them to court to show that they owned the land and not Moses' father. So when Moses was little, he lost his inheritance, and he and his mother didn't have anything. So he became a scribe, and when he grew up, he made it clear in the text that he always knew once he had a position where people would listen to him and care about him, he was going to go to court and get his father's land back. And so he gets together witnesses who know him, who knew his father, who knew they owned the land, because in Egyptian law, the testimony of witnesses was actually used much more often than written documents. And of course, there was not great literacy in the ancient world, and so you would expect that there would be more people who would remember things than people writing them down. And so he took a number of witnesses to court, and I'll read you a little bit from the text from his tomb, because all of them taking the great oath. And the great oath is that as Amun endures, so the god Amun, and as the ruler endures, meaning the king, but they never dare say the king's name. So they all say, as Amun endures and as the ruler endures, I am telling the truth. And if I'm not telling the truth, you may cut off my nose and ears and banish me from Egypt. So they take this rather incredible oath that has quite serious results if they're lying, and they then go on to say that they know this man and they knew his father and he had the land. And then it's very interesting, because then the vizier said, well, let's get the tax documents and see if this man's father was paying taxes on the land, or who was paying the taxes, because whoever's paying the taxes owned the land. So the vizier said, let us get the land register from the treasury and the granary. And so they were all taken downstream. So they had to get on the boat and go down to Per Ramses, which was the royal city of Ramses II. And they went to the treasury of the pharaoh, and they went to the office of the granary, and they took the 2 land registers of the tax payments, and they took it back to court. And the vizier looked at who had paid the taxes and gave Moses his land. So that was the 5th court case that had been filed about this land. But you see, the kind of documentation that they kept is very impressive in terms of dealing with these kinds of suits. All right, now, there's one other way that law could be carried out that I want to mention before we do the assassination, and that is the oracle. In the very late New Kingdom, you could either take something could be heard in court, or you could take a problem to court if you were a private person, or you could use the oracle. And the oracle was done if a particular god came out in procession out of their temple. They could be asked to settle disagreements, or to find thieves, or things like that. And in the village of Dar el Medina, the saint that one of the kings who became a saint and was worshipped in this village was Amenhotep I. And there was a chapel of Amenhotep I in the village. And 8 men would pick up a litter that had a wooden statue of the king on it, and they would come out into the village. And sometimes people would ask, who stole, who stole my goat? In fact, there's a known case where a number of garments were stolen, and the man who they were stolen from knew who he thought had taken them. It was the daughter of a scribe in the village. But the scribe had a higher sort of social status than this man, and he was afraid to go to court about it. So he asked the priest to let him talk to the oracle as he came through the village. And so they proceeded to walk through the village, and then the priest would stop with the litter right in front of the door of the person they thought was guilty. And I know it sounds very odd to us to think that, you know, these people could carry this wooden thing and then go to a certain place and stop, but it's apparently it was believed in. And perhaps the priests, because in villages most everybody knows what everybody does and what everybody has done, and if something happens they usually know who did it. Perhaps they all sort of knew who had taken these garments. But anyway, they stopped at the house of the scribe, and the girl admitted that she had taken the garments and gave them back. So the oracle was believed in because it was the god making a decision. And a lot of the decisions were made by how the oracle moved in procession. You could if you were having a problem with an inheritance and you were fighting with someone over inheritance, you could write on one piece of stone, "I inherit," and put it on one side of the road. And you could write on another stone, "So and so in my family inherits," and put it on the other side. And the priest would come down carrying the litter with the statue of the god. And then they would either go to the right or go to the left, and that would give the answer. So there was movement involved, and sometimes the oracle would come out and someone would stand on the side of the road and say, "Did a certain thing happen?" And the oracle would go forward to say yes and backward to say no. And so this was a way of solving things that was accepted and used quite often, particularly for problems with inheritance and for thefts when you were afraid to go to court and accuse someone of something. But it carried the same weight as going to trial. So that's kind of unusual, and that went on for quite a long time, several hundred years in Egypt. And it also might have, some people think, been popular with people because there are times that the courts seem to have gotten rather corrupt, and that people thought they would get better justice out of the oracle than out of the court. All right, now Ramses III died in 1153 BC. He had been king for 31 years, and he was in his harem in a palace in Thebes, and there was an assassination. For many, many years, people didn't know if he died actually in the assassination or was wounded or given poison and died later. But a few years ago, they did an MRI of his mummy, which had never been done before. And they discovered that his throat had been slit. So yes, he definitely died immediately when he was attacked. And the documents that we have are a collection of the names of the people who were guilty of this planned assassination and how guilty, and based on how guilty they were and how much they had to do with the assassination, their punishment. And it's rather interesting. There's 31 men and 6 women, plus the queen that started it all, the minor queen who wanted her son to get the throne, who was the one who started the idea of assassinating her husband. And then the young man that she wanted to put on the throne instead of the oldest son of the oldest queen, who was the one who was supposed to get the throne. And so these documents list starting with the most guilty, and they say that they were examined. Now, sometimes documents for like tomb robberies, when they say that they were examining people, they often said they were examined with the stick, which meant that there was a lot of beating going on. And often there was quite a bit of torture when they were examining. They don't always say it. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. So they said they were examined, they were found guilty, and their punishment befell them. So they were punished. Now, if you are guilty of being part of a group that has killed the king, of course you're going to get the death sentence. But they don't say that. They always sort of talk around these things. So they say their punishment befalls them. But it meant that at that time they would have died by impalement. And I don't really know how that works, except that it's a very hard stick with a point, and they put you on it face down and leave you there, I guess, until it gets all the way through your body. I, they don't really talk about it in Egypt. They just say that they were put upon the stick, and that means that they were put to death by being impaled. And then there was another group of people who were guilty, but not as guilty as the ones who were put on the stick. And they say, and they examined them, they found them guilty, and they left them where they were, and they took their own lives. Now, these people then were told they had obviously to kill themselves. But I have no idea how you committed suicide in ancient Egypt. I was looking around in books for toxicology in the ancient world and things like that. And the only actual poison I could find were snakes, cobras, but they make no mention of that. I don't know how these people would have put themselves to death. If there was some sort of plant, a poisonous plant they were made to eat or drink, I have no idea, and no one who has written about this particular document seems to even bring up the fact that they don't know what that means. And the young man the young prince who was going to take the throne, he was found guilty, and they left him where he was, and then they say he took his own life. But again, I have no idea what that actually means happened to him. The queen that started the whole assassination to get her son on the throne, we don't hear about it all. It could be that the document has been lost, or it could be that they just don't even mention her. They just leave it out. But she must have also been put to death, probably left to commit suicide. But we don't know how that would have been carried out. So, in terms of crime and punishment, mostly in terms of the state, it's a crime against a royal tomb or something stolen from a temple, or a corrupt high official. And those types of things were given the death penalty by the state. Anything that could have harmed the state or the king or anything to do with a god or a goddess, you see, it was basically treason against the state and got the death penalty. But we only in Ramesside times, in the times that I've been talking about, know that people died by impalement, although I don't know the details of how the impalement was carried out. So in other periods, we're not sure how these things happened or how they were done. So do you have any questions on perhaps other crimes or other situations?
Thank you for a really wonderful lecture. It was great pleasure to listen to you. And
Thank
all
you.
the time I was thinking about our, let's say, cliche that basically criminal law in Egypt is less cruel in punishment than in other ancient civilizations. Do you share that opinion? And do you have some arguments pro, or you have some arguments contra? Definitely, it is not comparable to think about punishment in Mesopotamia and in Egypt. But having in mind ancient law as general, would you also say that?
Well, when you talk about, for example, he was questioned with the stick. That had to do with apparently a way of hitting your hands on the bottom of your feet that's called the bastonado, I think in Spanish. And that gets very painful. And then they also in the tomb robbery papyri, they mention twisting. And apparently this was something where of twisting wrists and ankles. And then the scribe would write, so they questioned him and there was twisting and he said, okay, I'll talk. So, I mean, it can't have been very nice. And we don't, and this seems also to have happened to women as well. I mean, they didn't make a distinction by gender and in the way in which the punishment was done. There are also other things that don't have to do with court at all, but examples like in rebellions and things like that in the third intermediate period in the late period of Egyptian history, where we know, for example, one Prince Osorkon of the 22nd dynasty, he was a high priest, and there was a rebellion and at Karnak Temple of people going against, I suppose, his father's rule. And he talks about knocking them down and tying them like goats and putting them on the barbecue or something like that. So, I mean, you do get these rather, not very many, but these indications that they were willing to burn people, that there was human sacrifice at times. That stops sort of early on, but there was human sacrifice. So I don't know. I don't know. I know the Assyrians were quite awful to people. I think maybe they're the most horrendous, perhaps.
And of Code of Hammurabi is considered as one of the most cruel codes, and that's why maybe we have this impression that those two civilizations are a bit different, even in this part of criminal law dealing with this penalty. And other idea, what I would like to ask you and to discuss with you is dealing with the use of oath in the criminal procedure. Do we have some let's say, reliable sources and papyri where the ritual and the whole idea of oaths, how it was used, and was it at least very present, or we do not have a lot of information about that?
No, the oath is used quite actively, and sometimes they question people, and they question them with beating and making them take the oath, because because you're taking the oath in the name of God, in the name of the king, and so if you're lying, you're in big trouble. It was like plagiarism at a sort of divine level. So it's a way of forcing you to realize you have to tell the truth, because you could be horribly punished if you lie using the name of the god Amun and the ruler. Yeah. So it's quite often used. And as I had that example in Moses' group of witnesses that were on his side, they each said, as Amun endures and as the ruler endures, I am telling the truth. And if I'm not, you can cut off my ears and my nose and banish me. So that was taken quite seriously, that they actually probably are telling the truth if they're willing to say that.
Perfect. Great. Thank you. Thank you so much.
All right.
Someone else?
Any other questions from anyone?
Well, if I may, if there's nobody else, I was just curious to continue this discussion about the severity of punishments. The examples that you've been talking about were mostly the very serious crimes against the king, the state, the temples, and so on. And it does not surprise us that there were death penalties for that. You could say there were death penalties for that up to the 20th century. But maybe not so much regarding the temples anymore, but at least the state. But what were the punishments like for the lesser crimes against an individual? So for theft again from a private person, for assault, maybe murder, injury, and so on. How much do we know about that?
Actually, the typical punishment was 100 blows. And sometimes it's 100 blows and 5 pierced wounds. Now, I don't know what the 5 pierced wounds are, but it's very interesting that a few years ago they found a couple of men buried at Amarna, and they had these strange kind of cut slices in their shoulder bones, where they had obviously had some kind of knife or something put into the shoulder blades. And they were wondering, is that what they did? That, because you wouldn't die from that, but it wouldn't feel very good for a long time. They were wondering if those people had suffered from the 5 pierced wounds, because no one's really understood, what do you mean by 5 pierced wounds? I mean, what are you piercing? So that's typical, and 100 blows is typical. Like if you stole something and you had gotten rid of it, so you couldn't give it back, then you would get you could have a deputy sent out by the local court, and you would get 100 blows. And sometimes then you're told to pay back, of course, not with money, because they didn't have money in ancient Egypt, but you'd have to give back enough stuff to cover the cost of what you stole plus something. So the punishment always seemed to be physical and right away. They didn't go to prison. They didn't have prisons like we have now. Everyone was sort of hurt in a physical way, and then it was over.
Yes, thank you. So that's efficient for the state at the time. They just do the beating and they're done with it. They don't have to keep the prisoners anywhere.
Yeah. Well, if they had someone who was a prisoner, that like if you, like in the time of Tutmosis III, if you were a young man who was told you're in the army now, and you ran away because you didn't want to go off to war, they would put you and your whole family in a quarry, and you'd all dig and cut rocks. And so that's not really a prison, but they can put you in very terrible labor as a punishment.
Thank you. Yes,
Yeah.
we had such punishments in Rome as well. I think the Romanists will correct me, but even when there wasn't much use of prisons in Rome, but sentencing of people to hard labor was already a
Yeah.
widespread thing.
Yeah. Yeah. And then probably, I mentioned the cutting off of the nose and the ears and being banished. That strikes me as utterly awful. But they would, you see, once, I assume you'd live through something like that, although I don't know what kind of infections or whatever you might get from something like that. But they were either put out in the Sinai, or they were sent to Upper Nubia after that happened. So you were mutilated like that, so you could never not be understood as someone who'd done something bad, and then you were sent off to one of these areas away from everyone else. So.
Do we actually have data about such punishments in practice? Because I know I was writing some comparative article about adultery, and I know that there's some mention in Greek sources. Diodorus says that an adulteress's nose was severed and so on, which is also a punishment that marks her for life, though it's comparatively mild compared to other laws at the time. But I read that, as far as I know, that there are no reports of such a punishment being carried out in practice.
Yeah. It was only a problem in terms of adultery if a man slept with another man's wife. If the woman was unmarried or something like that, it wasn't a problem at all. There are cases in this local court that I talked about at Darrell Medina, where there was adultery, and that seemed to be settled privately by the husband getting the other man beaten up. It didn't really seem to be something that the court solved. It seemed to be more of sort of get all your friends and let's get this guy sort of response. But you were supposed to leave married women alone.
Okay, thank you very much. Professor Poloyet?
Oh, there you are. I hear you.
I would like to continue about adultery, because in Rome also woman is very severely punished. She can be killed by her by her father if she's kept in adultery. It seems that women are more severely punished than men. And you mentioned that the adulterer, man who was kept in adultery, was then that it was in fact private revenge by the husband of. So this is interesting. My question is about woman. How is she punished, and how, and what was the case? Is there any evidence about that?
Actually, the only evidence is really that if her husband wanted to divorce her for being an adulteress, she had to give up all of the material goods that she brought into the marriage, because marriage was not a state. It was not anything religious or state There was we don't know of anything they signed or any documents or any a marriage just started when a woman moved in with a man in public, and it was understood that they were living together and planning on having children. And so a divorce was simply her leaving again. But if she had been an adulteress, she could not take with her when she left any of her own property. She lost it all to him. Whereas otherwise, anything she took into the marriage, she could also take out of the marriage. So there was not a terrible punishment. No.
Yeah.
I mean, economically, yes, but I mean, not physically.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Are there any more questions? Anyone? If not, I would like to thank Professor Sabbahy once again for her wonderful lecture. I think we've all learned some things we didn't know about ancient Egyptian law, and it was very interesting. And we really do hope that maybe one day you'll come to Belgrade in person and hold another lecture, and Professor Avramovich agrees.
Okay.
Sure. You see the finger.
Yeah. Soon as the world gets normal.
It was really great.
Thank you very much. All right. Nice meeting you all. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone, for your attention. Next week we have a lecture in Serbian, so we can't invite you to listen, but for those who can, the lecture will be about ancient Greek warfare.
Oh my goodness. Excellent. Okay. Thank you so much. Well, if you have anyone else who does it in English, let me know, please.
We have 2 weeks from that, but it's a medieval lecture about cities in the Middle Ages, Professor Mili Lubin.
Interesting. Okay. Well, so nice to meet all of you, and take care.
Thank you very much.
Thanks again. All the best.
All right. Bye-bye.
Goodbye and good night.
Very much.
Good night. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.